Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today I would like to focus a little bit and talk about medieval armor and medieval clothing, but specifically within the context of extreme weather conditions. Now, given extreme weather conditions, of course, when we're talking about the cold in this case, winter weather, what's considered to be extreme very much depends on where you're from. I'm a man from the Mediterranean. For me, already 50 degrees Fahrenheit is extreme, but if you're a Northern European, you'll probably be laughing your heads off at that. But regardless, I think today was a fantastic opportunity to do some testing, because outside it's snowing right now. And that's great because, one, I can film some really good looking footage in medieval clothing and armor that I can use for the video that I will be posting tomorrow, which is a video on the origins of the medieval knight. So you will see that footage in glorious 4K tomorrow. But today we can still use the experience and a little bit of the footage to discuss how difficult it was for me to stay outside in winter weather wearing nothing but medieval clothing and armor. So make sure to come and check the video tomorrow for the deep historical analysis, and for today, let's go and do some testing. Okay, so the first thing I would like to say, in order for us to be a little more scientific, is to tell you precisely what I mean when I say, well, it was cold. So the specific temperature that we had when I was wearing my plate armor outside was around 32 Fahrenheit. So we are around 0 degrees Celsius. Obviously, that's not like incredibly cold. We're not talking minus 20 type of cold, but it was still cold. And wearing plate, I have to say, it was very insulating. And even without the armor, I mean, with the armor on, I could have been outside for hours and it wouldn't have bothered me. On the other hand, my wife was wearing regular clothing, such as, a jacket, a hoodie, and she felt the cold more than me. And that's important, because usually I'm the one who's sensitive to the cold. So I think that a large factor of that was the sort of insulation that I was getting, not only because of the armor and the plates, but also specifically the plates in combination with the sort of fabrics that I was wearing, aka my 15th century Northern Italian arming doublet based on the paintings by Piero della Francesca. It is important to say, however, that I think one of the most important aspects of me being able to sustain the cold outside is the fact that there was no wind, virtually no wind. I believe if the wind had been stronger, then my hands and my face would have been severely affected. With that being said, of course you can wear gauntlets. I do have a pair of medieval gauntlets that I did put on, and the moment those were on, not a problem. And that has to do, I'm not confident enough to speak about the physics involved. If you are, please let me know. But plates of steel must be really good for some reasons. But what about your face? Well, you can wear a helmet. In my experience, one thing that I noticed is that depending on the helmet, up to this point, the one helmet that really appears to be excellent defense, not only against the cold and in general, but most likely the wind, although I still haven't had a chance to test that extensively, is my frogmouth. And I think the reason is the fact that the frogmouth helmet has a massive solid plate of steel in front of your face. Whereas, for example, a helmet like this one, still good, definitely better than wearing nothing, but if you open the visor, yeah, never mind, but even with the visor down, it is a lot more open. It has openings because you need to be able to see through these, you need to be able to breathe, it's good for ventilation, excellent against overheating, but then again, when it's 0 Celsius outside, overheating was not low in the list of things that were in my mind, but something like this would still provide some protection, some shielding from extreme wind, but not as good or as well as a frogmouth. Moral of the story, if you're outside and it's windy, do wear your frogmouth helmets. Another question that we may have is there a big difference between wearing full plate when it comes to your major protection for your torso or just wearing a brigandine? Well, I am specifying torso because if you see in my configuration here, even though the helmet is not, it's kind of a old school helmet, that would be with that kind of brigandine that I have, which is a 15th century brigandine, and so are my shoulders and arms. Really, that helmet is more of a late 14th century, so it would be either a knight who is messing around with his dad's helmet, maybe even granddad, or I should be wearing something more like an armor or some other kind of helmet. But with that being said, still for testing, it was fun to put on, also to give us a visual difference between the other set that I'm wearing with the frog mouth and this one. When it comes to dealing with 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit, brigandine, full plate, they are both absolutely fine, and I didn't see a massive difference or any difference that would be numerically significant, even if we were to use electronic tools or any sort of machinery to quantify the persistence of my core body temperature. Of course, the fact that I'm wearing full plate arms and shoulders, as opposed to, for example, having your shoulders also made of brigandine, is historically justifiable. If anything, I would say it's the most common way. Let me show you. If we spend some time with actual medieval iconography, you'll see that, of course, the brigandine will appear several times, more often in some countries than others. I think Italy has got quite a lot of, and France, have got quite a lot of representations of brigandines. For example, this one, it's a red brigandine that you see this man is wearing. This is from the late 14th century, and you see the man on the right is wearing a brigandine. But in Germany too, this is from Bavaria, 1375, I believe, and you see that this guy is also wearing a red brigandine. Gorgeous one, in fact. And still from Germany, we've got 3 different patterns of colors, and you can see that the arms are in fact full plate. They don't appear to be wearing any specific brigandine arms or brigandine shoulders. Everything is in plate, a bit like mine, although this is in the German style. Note, and then the brigandine being the only factor that is in plate, which of course is a viable option. They will be wearing mail. You can kind of see it with the guy in red here. That is in fact ditching the shoulder plates. That's something that people did sometimes. These two do have spolders in plate, but this guy decided, nah, mail is enough. And so you can see that this is most likely part of the shirt of mail that he is wearing underneath his brigandine. And of course, for context, for those of you who forgot about it, a brigandine does have, of course, fabric in the outside. It usually can be wool, it can be linen, it can be silk velvet, like in my case, but the inside is all plates of steel. This is a French image that I always find interesting to discuss varieties within brigandine settings. For instance, you can see that this guy has got a brigandine, black and silver brigandine breastplate, but his fold is plate. It looks yellow. It could be that it was gilded because this guy has a lot of money. But what's interesting is that historically we also find the opposite, where the breastplate is actual plate and then the fold and even the placket would be steel. So both configurations exist. And still in France, we see a heavy usage of all sorts of brigandines. Worth of note, this guy wearing a blue brigandine with a blue and silver brigandine, and I love the mace that he's holding. I mean, I wish I had something like that. Still, within the topic of brigandine, I think this is one of my favorite images. So I still don't have the legs, working on it, but my arms are kind of similar, although he has got smaller shoulders, and at the moment my pauldrons are full 15th century pauldrons. They exist too in iconography in combination with brigandines, and I will show you another one, but I think it's a beautiful representation of, once again, a sort of closed helmet that he's wearing. Then he's got the brigandine because of course it provides a lighter and more articulated torso defense that kind of it's easier to wear, possibly less expensive unless you really go for silk velvet like I did, as opposed to like full plate. And then, you know, he still has these arms. And note that he's not wearing gauntlets. Sometimes I get reprimanded on my videos when I don't wear gauntlets, but I am still wearing full plate. Well, we do see that happening in war and in tournament in iconography. So it's not like everyone all the time always wore gauntlets or mittens. Oftentimes they did, of course, but not everyone did, so it's fine. Now, whether my hands will be fine or not, that's a completely different discussion. Here we see a guy wearing a blue brigandine and a guy wearing some kind of orange brigandine right next to a guy in full plate. So as you can see, both are viable options. And it's interesting that this guy on the left does appear to have a left big pauldron, a bit closer to my style. But as I always say, for those of you who are interested in this and are like, but would you have shoulders in brigandine too? And yes, the answer is yes, and we see it in iconography. Here is another wonderful sort of image or illumination from France, and we are in the 15th century here, 1440, and I think it looks gorgeous. The brigandine shoulders look really good, and the closing method of this brigandine appears very similar to mine once again. And for context, mine is a brigandine. It's often called the Leeds brigandine simply because it's displayed in Leeds, but it's an Italian model. Kind of wanted to underline that. See, often people just say the Leeds brigandine. It's not an English model, it's an Italian model nonetheless. note that in this configuration, which could still be considered, it's very well protective, but it's a little lighter since he's not wearing arm harness and he's just using mail for the protection of his arms. So the Brigandine is a fantastic choice, and I love it. Whenever I want to, for instance, if I were to go tomorrow to, let's say, an event, it could be like a Renaissance festival, I would probably go in my Brigandine with plate arms and possibly plate legs rather than in full plate armor, simply because it's just easier to pull off if you're going to be outside for a very long time, if I'm going to be standing for a very long time, of course, and it's not like I'm going on my horse, right? So that would be one of the reasons why, as a modern person, I would choose the Brigandine in those situations. But I have to say that plate would still be my favorite if I was a medieval knight and I was going to go on a campaign, I think. But then again, more testing might be needed. But what about the defense from the cold? Well, I have to say that the Brigandine still insulated me very well. Maybe not as well as plate, but when I was wearing the Brigandine, I still didn't shiver. I still didn't feel the cold. And I mean, unless you put me in Northern Europe, in which case it probably doesn't matter. You could put me inside of an oven and I would still be shivering a cold. And I thought that was fascinating because I was actually expecting to be colder in the Brigandine, but that wasn't the case. Another thing that we can ask is how different would the climate, the weather conditions, whether it be extreme hot, whether it be extreme cold, or seasonal specific temperatures between the medieval period and now. And this is a very complex question, and it varies place by place, century by century. But one thing that we could say, even if you choose one of those areas that will have a difference in terms of the sort of climate that you would have in comparison to what you're testing your gear in, I still think you would be able, depending on where you are, to still garner excellent data, because whatever difference that it wouldn't be so dramatic, at least in my opinion, in general, as to render any experience that we could have today as reenactors or for experimental archaeology completely useless. We can use the data also because weather always has a range of variability. You don't always have the exact same temperature every day for the entire season, and so even if the one day when you're out, it would represent a day on the milder side of a medieval winter season rather than the coldest they could get, that would still work, and it could be compensated by, for example, going to a country that is colder than the modern equivalent where you're filming. So all of this can be used, and just to give you one example, when it comes to weather data, you have the climate of Anatolia, which we believe that in the 11th century was not significantly different to that of recent years. Which means, once again, that modern data can be used to provide hypothetical weather schemes, particularly if you're wearing period-accurate clothing. Now, the impact of harsh weather is recorded in the sources, and it is a major problem when it comes to medieval life, not only during times of war, but also during times of peace. For instance, we do know that a rapid onset of cold weather could mean a severe loss of livestock, just as an example, and we do have a historical mention of that, which connects perfectly to the sort of material evidence that was found at Shapwick, Somerset, where a mass burial of ovine and bovine was found, and it's most likely explained as a impetus brought forth by severe harsh weather that just occurred quickly, and the animals died. If we want to focus and approach this in a scholarly manner, in an academic manner, we shouldn't just focus on the sort of clothing and clothing availability of people in the medieval period, or maybe access to fire in order to warm themselves up. So, of course, if you were poor and it was really cold, you may die because you can't cover yourself and you don't have shelter. So shelter, access to fire, access to good, warm clothing, this is all obvious. But if we read the sources, when it comes to, for example, sort of difficulties faced during winter seasons in, say, the 1250s, we see that there is another mention or another item of discussion that we should insert when we talk about these: harvest failure. Not only because nutrition is very important when it comes to the ability to sustain the weather, but also it specifically connects to the loss of livestock. That is because if you have harvest failure, if you have an economic crisis, it could mean that you don't have sufficient fodder for your animals. And of course, cattle, but also sheep, goats, these are all ruminants, and one of their characteristics is that the source of body heat when it comes to their core comes from the food they eat. To be more specific about it, because of bacterial fermentation of the food they consume. So, if you have dearth, underfed animals will struggle to maintain even core body temperatures, which could lead to death. And all of this without even tackling the susceptibility of any given population cluster to airborne diseases. Maybe on a dedicated video. Regardless of the period that we would be focusing on for our research, the environment has always been a beast and a massive problem to deal with, whether it be a medieval kingdom, whether it be a early modern settlement or major city, or whether it be classical antiquity. And we could say that it is in fact in the modern period that we start to be able to not only face some of these difficulties that have to do with the weather, but also that we start to understand them, and things that are impossible to predict for a medieval king, as well as medieval peasants and farmers, in the modern period, thanks to the development of technology, become more easy to prepare for. The lack of the ability to prepare for some of these events is in fact probably one of the nastiest aspects of having to live in the Middle Ages, in classical antiquity, and whatnot. At the same time, though, we shouldn't underestimate the ability to regulate and maximize or optimize your chances to survive harsh weather conditions and even unpredictable events of people of the past. You may not be able to precisely calculate the, say, calorie expenditure that each agent or person, whether it be a medieval guard, whether it be a soldier on campaign, or whether it be once again a farmer or a fisherman, would have to need and spend depending on specific climate variations. But at the same time, even with a lack of specific scientific methods or technology to be precise about these calculations, the results of the conditions can still be studied in order to manipulate the environment around you and the way you face the repercussions of certain actions over others. That sort of deductive logic was in fact something that the ancients, medieval people, excelled at because of two things that they had access to: experiential knowledge and accumulated knowledge as a species. Which is why I'm going to say that most likely one of the greatest inventions for mankind was the ability to pass along knowledge in the written form. Okay, what about the regular clothing? Well, obviously without the help of armor, regular clothing didn't necessarily give me any advantage over modern clothing. The sort of medieval garments that I'm wearing, that I have, are very well made, and it's kind of on the high end. So it's something that a merchant, a nobleman, a successful man-at-arms or entrepreneur of the medieval period would have been able to afford. The sort of, for instance, of boots that I'm wearing, handmade leather boots, well, those worked perfectly. In fact, they worked a lot better than I thought. They were excellent. I did not get any spilling. No snow went inside my shoes, my boots, and hit my feet, for instance. My feet were not cold, and what I'm about to say is going to surprise you, but my medieval boots worked better than cheap modern shoes. The sort of stuff that you will buy at a market, perhaps made in China, that is inexpensive, you can buy for $20, $30. Well, those are worse. They break, they get holes, sometimes they get covered in snow or water, and then the water goes through the fabric. And I would rather, now that I've experienced it, I would rather wear my medieval boots if I had to walk for 50 miles in snow than any cheap type of shoes that were made in the modern period. Now, given you can have specialized hiking shoes or stuff that people use that actually works really well and would work better than the medieval counterparts, of course, but I have to say that I was expecting my feet to get really cold. Instead, they didn't. Maybe that has to do with the thickness of the leather specifically in this case, but I must say I was really impressed with how well my medieval boots functioned in 6 to 7 inches of snow. And also because of the sort of grip that the soles had on the snow. I had no problems slipping or falling, for instance, by wearing my medieval boots. Alright, noble ones, but I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet a member of this community, become a noble one, subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Stay warm. Goodbye.